Hey everyone, this is Mark Leon Goldberg, your Global Dispatches host. I wanted to once again share with you an episode of our brand new podcast, To Save Us from Hell. This is a weekly show about the United Nations in which co-host Anjali Dayal and I discuss the latest news and happenings from around the United Nations. In the episode today, we discuss what escalating tensions in northern Israel and southern Lebanon means for UNIFIL. This is the United Nations peacekeeping force stationed in southern Lebanon. We also discuss an upcoming meeting between international representatives and the Taliban that is convened under UN auspices. And later, we interview Courtney Fung, an academic who studies China's evolving relationship to the United Nations. To Save Us from Hell is available wherever you get your podcasts. It is hosted on Substack, and crucially, we are funding this new show exclusively by selling subscriptions via Substack. So for listeners to Global Dispatches, you can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes of this episode. I would so appreciate your support. We've gotten great feedback in just the first episode that we published. This is episode number 2, probably the last episode that I'll publish directly to this feed for a while. Enjoy, and again, please support our work by getting a paid subscription on globaldispatches.org. Thank you, and here is To Save Us from Hell, our new podcast about the United Nations. Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am Mark Leon Goldberg, an international affairs journalist, editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch, and I run Global Dispatches. And To Save Us from Hell is a project of Global Dispatches.
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international relations at Fordham University in New York, and I teach and research and write about the UN.
This week, we will be talking about UNIFIL, the United Nations peacekeeping force stationed in southern Lebanon. In recent days, the prospect of an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah has become somewhat heightened for reasons we will discuss. So what would happen with these some 10,000 UN peacekeepers should war break out on this front in southern Lebanon? And what role might UNIFIL play in preventing an escalation along this front?
And then we'll talk a little bit about the UN's Doha 3 meeting on Afghanistan, which they're convening from June 30th to July 1st, where Afghan women are not going to be at the table. And we'll talk a little through what that means and what it tells us about how the UN approaches tricky situations of balancing rights and political resolutions.
Then we are joined by Courtney Fung, an academic well known in UN circles for her research on China's approach to multilateralism and the United Nations. She explains how China's approach to the UN is changing as China becomes a more powerful international player.
If you go off as a Chinese international civil servant, there is this expectation that you will be able to bring Chinese ideas, Chinese wisdom into solving problems of global governance.
Since October 7th, Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces have been trading fire on a near daily basis. While these attacks have been deadly and have caused significant displacement in both Israel and Lebanon, they've been limited in scale. However, ever since October 7th, the big worry around the United Nations has been one of regional escalation. And the most likely pathway for this escalation is an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah. These concerns have been heightened in recent days. Just today, we saw Netanyahu suggest that the military engagement in Gaza would be winding down soon, in part so that military resources could be sent to the north to confront Hezbollah. This follows an announcement by the IDF that they've put together a plan to attack Hezbollah should political leaders order it. Meanwhile, Hezbollah's rhetoric is becoming increasingly bellicose. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has threatened an all-out war. So amidst this escalating rhetoric, a few days ago, Antonio Guterres delivered remarks expressing profound concern about this very apparently deteriorating situation and warned of the dire consequences should an all-out war break out in Lebanon and Israel.
The world must say loudly and clearly, immediate de-escalation is not only possible, it is essential. There is no military solution. Further military escalation will only guarantee more suffering, more devastation to communities in Lebanon and Israel, and more potentially catastrophic consequences for the region.
So in the middle of this all are about 10,000 UN peacekeepers deployed to the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. What role might these peacekeepers play in de-escalating this crisis on the one hand, or on the other, what would happen if this UN peacekeeping mission gets caught up in the crossfire of two heavily armed warring parties? Before we get to these deep questions, though, Anjali, can I just have you give a quick background and history on UNIFIL?
So UNIFIL has been on the ground since 1978 to confirm Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon. It's charged with monitoring the cessation of hostilities, with restoring international peace and security in the region, and with assisting the Lebanese government in its efforts to restore effective authority in the area. It helps ensure humanitarian aid and access to the civilians in the area gets through, and it's charged with helping with the safe return of displaced persons. Its mandate has been adjusted twice in the years since it was deployed, once in 1982 and once in 2000, both in response to crises on the ground. And after the 2006 crisis between Israel and Lebanon, the UN Security Council enhanced the presence of UNIFIL on the ground, and it stepped up the robustness of its tasks. Today, that means that UNIFIL has more peacekeepers per kilometer on the ground than any other mission in the world. And that's about 10,000 peacekeepers around the world, mostly from Indonesia and India, some from Italy, Ghana, Nepal, Malaysia. Spain rounds out the contingent. And it's a classic interpositional peacekeeping mission. What we mean by that is that it is a group of multinational, lightly armed soldiers who are on the ground to serve essentially as a buffer between warring parties and in a contested zone, and to do things like prevent little accidents from spiraling up into larger scale conflict, to ensure that all sides have easy communication flow through the UN system, and to make sure that things are calm and peaceful on the ground.
So, Anjali, you referenced the 2006 conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. Essentially, this erupted after Hezbollah attacked Israeli military positions in Israel and in southern Lebanon, kidnapping some number of Israeli soldiers, killing some number of Israeli soldiers. Israel responded with a real pummeling of southern Lebanon. It was a short war. It was an intense conflict. It ended through a cessation of hostilities agreement backed by a Security Council resolution known as Resolution 1701. And this greatly expanded the presence of UNIFIL on the ground and essentially gave UN peacekeepers the mandate to support the Lebanese government as they sought to kind of rid this area, which is between the Litani River, which kind of bisects a bit of southern Lebanon on the northern side, and on the southern side, what's known as the Blue Line, which is basically the non-technical boundary between Israeli forces on one side and Lebanon on the other. So they have this kind of narrow strip that UN peacekeepers are intended to patrol to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't reconstitute itself and to give Israel the assurances it needs that Hezbollah won't launch attacks on Israel from southern Lebanon. And they're doing this all ostensibly in support of the Lebanese armed forces, which in reality is a very weak military power, at least compared to Hezbollah.
And I think it's also important to know what that really looks like on the ground, which is at the end of the day, what peacekeepers are actually doing is that they are driving around and smiling and waving at people in villages, getting a sense of what the atmosphere is like, getting a sense of whether there are small disagreements that might spark up into conflict and spiral out into bigger situations. If you are looking for like a terrific visual sense of what this is, there's a good French documentary called Last Station Before Hell. And you can follow along with these troops as they basically drive through. They say hello to people, they see what's happening. At the end of the day, even though this is an enhanced military presence, it's still fundamentally a peacekeeping presence. It is a set of troops that's on the ground, essentially to get the temperature between the different factions in this conflict and to try and tamp down on hostilities. This is not an offensive fighting force.
It's very much like a platform for local deconfliction, right? And
Yeah.
local de-escalation. That's at least how it has been for most of its history from 2006 until now. And also, I think not insignificantly, it is a platform in which Hezbollah and the IDF can communicate with each other, which is important because in these kinds of very fragile, very uncertain situations, you want to have lines of communication open so there are fewer opportunities for miscalculation.
And it's part of what makes peacekeeping historically novel and interesting, right? This is a set of troops that's there to help support the cause of peace by serving as a communications channel, by making sure that parties to a conflict have a way to interact with each other that doesn't immediately escalate. And it's part of this old guard of actually very successful interpositional missions if we consider the alternative. We consider the alternative being that since 1978, there's been no clear way for these different parties that are in conflict to communicate with each other and tamp down on local tensions or see potential conflicts spiraling out every time.
And it's worth remembering that back in 2006, both Hezbollah and Israel wanted an off-ramp. And this idea of putting a robust number of UN peacekeepers in Southern Lebanon worked to everyone's advantage at that time. And I think unique among peacekeeping missions today, and I think this is significant as we discuss what the future of UNIFIL lies as conflict and tensions between Israel and Hezbollah escalate, is that there is a significant contingent of European troops. It's led by a Spaniard. And while Indonesia is the single largest troop contributing country, Europeans make up a very large contingent. And I think that's significant. So one of the key tasks of UNIFIL under 1701, that Security Council resolution that expanded UNIFIL's mandate in the wake of the 2006 war, is to assist the Lebanese armed forces to assert control in southern Lebanon in areas that had previously been controlled more or less by Hezbollah. Now, over the last several years, the Lebanese state has become weaker and weaker. There is just an absolutely massive economic crisis befalling Lebanon right now. Concurrent with that, Hezbollah has become stronger and stronger militarily. They are a better armed, better equipped fighting force than they were back in 2006. And there is some evidence that they are reestablishing themselves south of the Litani River and north of that blue line. And that is what has Israel so profoundly concerned right now. They're worried that Hezbollah could pull off what Hamas did and send their fighting forces over the border and attack elements and attack towns in northern Israel. Meanwhile, Hezbollah also has a powerful arsenal of rockets that can reach pretty much anywhere in Israel. And in the context now of this conflict in Gaza, everyone is really on edge, particularly because Israel and Hezbollah have been more or less daily engaged in armed conflict, though limited thus far.
Yeah, we heard the Secretary General say the other day that his deep concern was that this was going to spiral into regional conflict, and noting that the people of Lebanon could not afford this kind of escalation as well, right? And basically calling on the parties to make sure that they tamp down on hostilities and try to sort of use these traditional channels of communication back and forth that are established exactly for this kind of reason. But it is important, I think, to note that UNIFIL is not there to directly confront military hostilities. That is a very tall task for a very small number of troops on the balance.
Yeah, like if Israel decides to overrun UNIFIL positions, they would be overrun. If Hezbollah decides to attack UNIFIL positions, they would be overrun. They're not there as a fighting force, right? They're not going to repel attacks. They're there to give both sides some breathing room. But if both sides no longer want that kind of breathing room, which seems to be the trajectory we're on, war could break out around them. And I'm wondering, Anjali, like, what would happen, do you think, if like an all-out conflict erupts in southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah? What would befall these 10,000 UN peacekeepers?
Yeah, I think it's important to note these classic interpositional missions. They are on the ground as lightly armed diplomats. They're not on the ground as poorly equipped soldiers, right? So the reason that they're there is to serve the function of peace. That requires that the parties to a conflict want them to serve the function of peace. If those parties no longer want a diplomatic channel, if they no longer want to act in service of the peace, there's very little peacekeepers can do. As you said, militarily, they'll be overrun. Practically speaking, what that means is that, the Security Council could decide to withdraw the mission at the end of the day. Now, the Security Council over the years has been very firmly committed, it says, to Lebanon's territorial integrity, right? To making sure that UNIFIL is there to not do the governance functions of the Lebanese government, but to serve as this buffer force to try and uphold the sort of security situation there. So one option, practically speaking, would be for the Security Council to draw down the mission there. We have seen that happen in the immediate aftermath of troops being targeted in peacekeeping missions before. What we've seen particularly in these missions around Lebanon also is that different national contingents, once they have been targeted, have decided to withdraw. So another potential option here is that if the mission becomes targeted, the individual national contingents, their capitals could decide to call them home.
Yeah, like they can go like, Jakarta could come under political pressure, domestic political pressure to get their, boys out of harm's way, so to speak, and could just have them fly out the next day if they wanted to.
Absolutely. So the Security Council could choose to draw down the mission, or the missions could sort of collapse by being hollowed out by national capitals calling their troops home.
So that's one eventuality. However, Netanyahu has also said that diplomatic options have not been foreclosed. And we have seen some really interesting diplomatic moves pertaining to UNIFIL just over the last few days. So the White House has an envoy kind of specifically to maintain and control escalation along this front. His name is Amos Hochstein. And he's been in the region recently, reportedly trying to find a diplomatic solution to prevent escalation along this front. And the reports have said that this includes expanding, in a way, the presence of UNIFIL. What do we know thus far, Anjali, about this idea, this proposal to use an expanded UNIFIL to satisfy some of Israeli and Hezbollah concerns?
Well, it seems very much like this is something that the Biden administration would like, but it depends again on the commitment of the Israeli government and Hezbollah to allowing the sort of mission to proceed and expand. And in the past, they have been willing. And the question that's open right now, I think, is whether or not they'd be willing to actually see an expansion of this mission. If the U.S. backs it and has buy-in from the Israeli government and Hezbollah, there's no reason to suspect that the Security Council wouldn't also back it and help expand the mandate. They've done that before, right? They are committed to making sure that this mission is in place and successful.
Yeah, I mean, the reporting that I've seen suggests that Hezbollah would agree to withdraw its forces at least like closer to the Litani River, if not on the other side of it. Israel might give up some modicum of territory along the blue line as a way to satisfy, to kind of give Hezbollah a way to say that they kind of won, give them a reason to accept this deal. And they would expand the number of troops in UNIFIL and give them potentially a more robust mandate to ensure that Hezbollah doesn't reconstitute itself again along that blue line. So it seems honestly like very similar to what we saw in 2006, in which UN peacekeeping became a very convenient solution that was almost like ready-made, tailor-made for a situation like this. So to the extent that conflict does not erupt in a really horrific way in southern Lebanon, I think it's fair to say that UN peacekeeping might have had a role to play.
I think that's right. You know, that the policy proposal is practical and it draws on tools that have worked in the past. And it draws on both sides being willing to invest in that process. And so that's what I think we would have to look for, right? We'd have to look for real moves from the parties to this conflict to say that they're not interested in escalating to full-scale conflict. And if they're not interested in escalating to full-scale conflict, then there is this important tool that's been working more or less to keep things in a diffuse, sort of workable way since 1978. I do think it's worth noting that this was never envisioned as a permanent solution to the problem of tensions between Israel and Lebanon. But like many peacekeeping missions, it's emerged as, a way to freeze the conflict in the absence of a clear political solution to the problem.
So on June 30th, about 30 representatives from governments around the world and from international institutions are meeting in Doha, Qatar, as part of a process convened under the auspices of the United Nations to find a way to engage with the de facto authorities in Afghanistan, otherwise known as the Taliban. Now, this particular meeting is the third iteration of what's known as the Doha process. The first iteration of that happened about a year ago and deliberately excluded the Taliban. It was just a way to get the international players kind of on the same page and how they might read from the same playbook when engaging with the Taliban. In the second iteration of that, it's kind of unclear whether the Taliban were invited or declined to attend. In any case, they did not attend. This time around, on June 30th, they were deliberately and explicitly invited to attend following a meeting in Kabul between Rosemary DiCarlo, the Undersecretary General for Political and Peace Building Affairs, a very senior UN official. And now everyone's meeting in Doha starting June 30th. And this has created a degree of controversy for the fact that there are no Afghan women participating in this meeting between these 30-odd international representatives on the one hand and the Taliban on the other. Anjali, help us make sense of what's going on.
Something to note up top is that under political pressure, they've announced that Undersecretary DiCarlo and others will meet with Afghan civil society members, including women, the day after the main process concludes. It's important to note that this is not what women's groups are asking for, though. It is not what Afghan women are asking for. What they are asking for is to be included as part of the key political process. And they're being actively excluded. This comes on the heels of, last year, the independent panel of experts examining the human rights situation in Afghanistan called the situation on the ground there akin to gender apartheid. Since the Taliban assumed authority again in 2021, we've seen a crackdown on women's ability to function in public spaces, to work outside the home, to work for NGOs or other international bodies, places where women had been able to be active over the previous decade and change.
And go to school after the age of 11.
And go to school after the age of 11, critically. And so we are seeing across Afghanistan this closing in on women's ability to be public, free, active individuals who are able to shape their own lives. And so the exclusion of women from a fundamental political process of engagement is happening in that context. And it's happening against the express wishes of Afghan women. Last year, the Taliban submitted this curious CEDAW report on the progress of women around Afghanistan.
And CEDAW is a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women. It's like the main UN human rights platform to address discrimination against women, of which the Taliban are very, very skilled.
That's right. Every couple of years, every state party has to submit a report on its progress toward meeting its obligations under international law towards women. Now, human rights in general, but women's rights in particular, rest on a really weak set of instruments and really weak set of protections. All of these rights depend on a state's ability to uphold them. And in that context, it was a little bit farcical for the Taliban to submit a report saying how it was attempting to meet its obligations under international law towards women. But one way to actually look at that ploy is to think of it as being a way to try and legitimize itself, right? And try and basically say, look, we are good international citizens. As part of a sort of campaign towards legitimizing themselves or to being accepted as legitimate political actors, they are making a sort of show of trying to accept their obligations under international law, even though the content of what they were submitting to CEDAW was absolutely farcical. Was proposing a vision of women's rights that really bears no resemblance to what we would expect full-scale women's rights to be. And this is the kind of thing where the Taliban doesn't need UN human rights experts to say, we think the Taliban is doing a terrific job. They just need other states to say, look, they're trying. They just need other states to give them political cover to proceed with this plan.
So do you see this meeting in Doha, therefore, as an extension of the Taliban's sort of desire to be seen internationally as the legitimate government of Afghanistan? Look, they are the de facto government of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They're the people you need to deal with if you're the United Nations and you need to, say, deliver food aid throughout Afghanistan. You need to work with the Taliban. They are the de facto authorities. But you are potentially arguing, and tell me if I'm wrong, that from the Taliban's perspective, it's great to be sitting across the table from Rosemary DiCarlo, because that means that, you are perceived as the legitimate representatives of the Afghan people.
That's right. In some sense, this is tricky, right? Because it is the case that Afghan women's groups also have argued that not engaging with the Taliban is not an option for international actors. They have to engage with the Taliban. It is the only way for the international aid and assistance that Afghan women need to enter the country, particularly in the face of desperate humanitarian conditions for the average citizen of Afghanistan. But the double-edged sword here is that it is basically what the Afghan scholar Orzala Nemat has called a strategy of normalizing misogyny. The outreach efforts have been a way for the Taliban to normalize their misogyny as they seek diplomatic engagement that the international community has to give them in order to get aid and assistance into the Afghan people.
To me, this just underscores a very kind of delicate position that the United Nations is in vis-a-vis Afghanistan. On the one hand, you saw, Human Rights Watch very, forcefully blasted the idea that the UN and other international entities would be meeting with the Taliban absent any Afghan women present. And I get that. They're Human Rights Watch. They have exclusively to focus on human rights. The UN has a lot more in its portfolio than human rights. I mean, it includes human rights, but it also includes humanitarian assistance. It includes development assistance. It includes counter narcotics. There's like a lot that the UN and other international actors have to deal with regarding Afghanistan. And so there is, I think, a degree of pragmatism that's potentially warranted when having to deal with the de facto authorities here. And I think it's also not insignificant that the UN official in charge of these talks is a woman, Also, a woman is the head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. She's a diplomat from Kyrgyzstan. So I think that's like not to be discounted either.
It's not to be discounted, but I think it's important to note that neither one of those women is Afghan.
Of course.
And traditionally, since the early 2000s, the instrumentalization of Afghan women, right? The use of them as a symbol, the use of them as a sort of political cover for invasion and for imperialist projects has been a key feature of the West's engagement with Afghanistan. But Afghan women have been very clear that nothing about them should happen without them, right? That they are political actors, that they are people with voices, and the presence of any woman in the room does not substitute for the presence of an Afghan woman in the room. And I think there are a couple of ways for us to look at that, right? You know, speaking of Human Rights Watch, last year, one of their Afghanistan experts, Sahar Fetrat, put out this key set of points about principled engagement with the Taliban. So not that international actors shouldn't interact with the Taliban, but they should do so in a way that's principled and that insists on the value of women's rights, that insists that Afghan women are involved in any discussions with international actors, right, about the future of Afghanistan, and by striving to provide the key aid and advocacy and support that Afghan women need. And in that context, you know, we always have this traditional discussion at the UN about the trade-off between immediate political expediency and long-term political inclusion. And even though this is like a maximum value on political repression, right? When we think about the Taliban's treatment of Afghan women, it exists on the same continuum of how do we balance rights and security, or how do we balance rights with pragmatic engagement. And in that sense, a way for us to think about this is the kind of engagement that you're going to get from the Taliban over the long term that actively excludes significant parts of the population is unlikely to produce long-term stability and success. And in that context, we have a ton of research that shows us that more inclusive political bargains are more likely to last. That inclusive sorts of dialogues that include all of the sort of affected members of society are more likely to endure. And so there's an expedient reason to do it also. The other thing is to note that expediency is not the only thing. So even though, as you say, the UN has all of these different things that it's trying to do simultaneously, the idea that it could do so by saying we're okay with excluding Afghan women from this debate has all kinds of downstream consequences, including undermining the core principles of Security Council Resolution 1325, which essentially says that women have to be key parts of processes like these. So it sets a bad precedent for other kinds of inclusions down the road. That doesn't mean the solution is necessarily easy, right? But it does mean that it's unlikely to produce the kind of inclusive political outcome they want if they're going to say, we'll meet with the Taliban days 1 through 3, and we'll meet you after they've left on day 4 and see what you have to say. We could even imagine a world in which they had flipped those things and said, look, we're going to meet with civil society and Afghan women first and make sure that even if the Taliban refuses to meet with them, we are bringing their concerns that they've given us to the table. I don't know if that would necessarily be what Afghan women wanted, but we can imagine a world in which that would be at least a sort of more free-flowing dialogue from civil society to high politics.
One thing also that this episode, I think, illustrates to me is how awkward it is for the United Nations when the de facto rulers of a country are not the ones that are represented at the United Nations itself. Like, who these days is representing Afghanistan in the halls of UN headquarters? I mean, it's not the Taliban.
No, it's the representative of the pre-Taliban government who has just continued to be seated after the fall of that government. It is, to the extent that anything about the situation is funny, right? This is almost like a Peter Sellers style comedy, right? Where there's like this one guy representing a government that doesn't exist anymore who sits at the UN because the UN doesn't want to be in the position of having to recognize the other government. So this guy shows up.
Votes in the General Assembly, like he has all the rights afforded to him as the legitimate representative of Afghanistan, but he doesn't represent Afghanistan in any sort of de facto manner.
In sort of like academic speak, we talk about the difference between juridical and empirical statehood, right? So in law, Afghanistan exists as one thing, and on the ground, Afghanistan exists as another thing. And so Afghanistan is running around in law as one set of understandings of stateness, and it's running around the world as another set of understandings of stateness. And for an organization like the UN, that's obviously like politically tricky to resolve, but it's also kind of funny at the end of the day. There's a lot of comic potential in that
There
situation.
is.
Yeah.
Armando Iannucci, if you are listening, this one's for you.
I think it is worth noting, at least putting on the table, that there's good reason to believe a lot of governments around the world are comfortable shoving women's rights obligations into a closet. Like, even though the Taliban has an extreme position on women's rights, CEDAW is not a particularly strong body of international law for a reason. It is widely adopted, and 189 countries have signed on to it. Only, I think, 2 have not ratified. Of course, the US is one of them. And at the end of the day, if you actually go and look at the ratifications, most countries have crossed out a ton of provisions because they don't believe they're bound to the body of law. And so the treatment of women, it's an easy political commitment to toss out the window when there are other political expediencies on the line. And countries are willing to do that over and over and over again. And so that we see it here isn't surprising. What is concerning is the absolute terror of the position that Afghan women find themselves in. And so even though we shouldn't be surprised by the willingness to give up on the commitment to women's rights, we should be uniquely concerned about it in a situation that the UN itself has described as akin to gender apartheid. Coming up next, we interview Courtney Fung, associate professor at Makerere University, about China's role at the United Nations.
Courtney, thank you so much for joining us on To Save Us from Hell. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark and Anjali.
To sort of set the scene for our chat today, can you just describe and explain, as China has become more powerful internationally, how has its relationship to the United Nations changed, if at all?
If we go back to sort of the first decade in 1971 to 1981, Chinese foreign policy at that time was very engaged and very concerned about managing Western hegemony, being very focused on third world politics. And so actually with very limited strategic interests, China was a very low profile participant in the UN Security Council. So no voting occurred on behalf of China for basically that first decade. And then we sort of see in the 80s through the 90s, through the early 2000s, a growing role for China within the UN, in the sense that China was really working with the system in order to try and understand the way in which China could engage as it was going through a period of economic modernization at home and the need for international stability abroad in order to support that type of economic development that was needed and prioritized at that time by sequential Chinese governments. And then we sort of reach the early 2000s, where I think we have now come to understand, it's becoming clearer, that the UN itself has become an important component for China in its foreign policy toolkit, in the sense that obviously, if we think about the basics of where the United Nations stands now, it still remains the only global institution that truly has 193 member states, plus many other multi-stakeholder participants coming in and out of different functional issues. So it's a one-stop shop for dealing with global politics. But of course, China stands ahead of all others with its permanent membership at the UN Security Council and therefore its veto. And so it's a very, very important space for Beijing to engage with the world and also shape the world around it. And so I think there are certain values that matter very much. And you see this played through in China's conviction that it must remain as part of the G77 plus China. And so real effort is put in to ensure that it maintains its standing within this group. You can see that reflected in debates about common but differentiated responsibility when it comes to questions of climate crisis and economic and ecological development issues. And so I think there is this real commitment to this belief that somehow the system has not been fair. And so there must be attempts to make it, quote, more fair. But I think at the same time, as we look at that, there are also other values that help guide the way that China engages. And I think it really is this fundamental commitment, this fixation about the need to protect state sovereignty. State sovereignty and other corollary ideas and principles that flow from that, like territorial integrity. When we talk about sovereignty in the sort of PRC elites conversation, it really is discussed as this idea that good fences will help make good neighbors. If we can respect each other's fundamental sovereignty, then we can therefore accept that there is a limited role for Chapter 7 non-consensual interventions, for example, and therefore we must emphasize the need for political dialogue, peaceful resolution, and consultation. But remember, language about dialogue, resolution, and consultation doesn't leave a lot of room when it comes to defending very particular rights. For example, human rights, for example, defending against mass abuse, even when conducted by the state. It doesn't leave as much room then for those types of questions.
What is China hoping to achieve at the UN?
There's a couple of things, and we can think about these overlapping baskets of interests that China is looking to achieve. There's the very sort of no state is unique in this position. Every state looks to advance their own particular interests within the UN system. Some of these interests for China are very parochial in particular. So you can track China's engagement on Resolution 2758 that it argues has actually determined Taiwan's international status. I think you can certainly read a large amount of scholarship that argues that Resolution 2758 does not do that. It simply settles that the China seat should transfer from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. So you can track how China has used the UN space in order to try and advance its own views and reinterpretation of Resolution 2758 throughout the UN system, and now as language being used when states transfer their recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. So you can see that language in the last couple of months being used outside of the UN system too. You can also see that China is like any other player, that it's also looking to try and create space, trying to understand where the margins are within the G77 plus China, within this large nebulous global South set, within the great powers. Where can China help carve out space to help make its own views the practical benchmark views?
I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk about personnel. As China has increasingly looked to the UN to do all the things, as you've described it, thinks it should do, is China trying to get more of its own people in senior or mid-level positions in the UN system?
It's certainly something that has seized headlines in the English language media for the last couple of years. I think language like China's overstuffing, overfilling these UN billets. The Chinese government, Chinese officials are very clear that they consider funding the UN an important contribution. They consider language an important contribution into the UN, so literally the words that we use to think about global governance problems. They also consider their voting practices as a contribution. And at the same time, they also consider their staff contributions into the international civil service as a key contribution too. Now, we have to remember a couple of years ago, I think this would have been back in 2020, they had 4 out of the 15 UN specialized agency headships, in part because they'd run effective campaigns, in part because these were overlapping posts, so that's why they had 4. And they also have, as the P5 do, each permanent member of the UN Security Council, by practice, I guess, at this point, each hold on to one other UN post. So the Chinese, for the last 3 decades, have headed the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Now, where we fast forward to where we are now, China is only heading the Food and Agricultural Organization and the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So again, First point is that, yes, these posts are important to Beijing. Second point, they don't have as many as they had a few years ago. And again, simply because the terms had ended, the incumbent term had ended, and now it was time for them to rotate out. The reason why these posts matter is in the sense for a couple of reasons. First off, China has very well understood that these posts aren't just functions of global governance. You aren't just doing the day-to-day mechanics. You are actually designing the agenda in which this agency will go about understanding its job. So to put this in a practical example, when China was head of the International Telecommunications Union, I believe Ambassador Power put this as the most important agency no one had ever heard of, or some quote to that effect. They were very keen in trying to set the standards in which there would be an interoperable future 6G telecommunications network. And so they very clearly understood by heading this particular agency, you would have that sort of first mover advantage in terms of trying to set strategic direction and manage the day-to-day operations. On top of it, there is all of this UN prestige and legitimacy and authority that comes from saying that Chinese wisdom and Chinese ideas, Chinese approaches to solving global governance problems are now becoming global UN-embraced approaches. This is very, very important for a player that has felt for far too long its recognition and its status in global politics has not been accepted. So there is a practical and sort of a much more intangible driver for why these posts matter. But again, I think it's very important to point out China's ability to move on these top posts came at a time when there was relatively, to be honest and frank about it, arguably Western neglect, in the sense that there wasn't so much attention being paid to who was running or doing what. There was faith that a lot of these jobs are kind of just ticking along and moving as they should. And certainly now, compared to a decade ago, there's far more attention being paid to what China is doing, and particularly what is China doing regarding international civil service contributions than certainly before. And that re-engagement by a host of other Western players, like-minded states, the United States and its other partners, have certainly changed the landscape in which Chinese candidacies can go. So if we look at the most recent record where China has run at the World Intellectual Property Organization, it has not been a success. At the World Maritime Organization, it has not been a success for Beijing. I think the last important thing to note that while we discuss this, it has to be remembered that by any national benchmark measure used, the overall staffing footprint, starting from administrative staff all the way through to executive level posts, the combined total, China is coming in far lower than what its national benchmarks should be. And that is grounds for Beijing to say that we must think about engaging, and maybe not just at the most executive senior level, but also as we think about interns that aren't staff, of course, but they contribute to the life of the organizations they're in, the junior professional organization posts, and other posts that move their way up the P&D rankings.
And P&D rankings, for those who are unfamiliar, is internal UN jargon that basically distinguishes where you are in the professional ladder, D being directorate, P being a little lower than that.
Exactly. So I think it's certainly a space to sort of keep an eye on the way that China is engaging with the system and the way that the system engages with China.
One of the things, if you ask around the UN, that people will highlight is how good Chinese diplomats at the UN actually are. So one set of questions for you, I think, is how we see the quality of this diplomacy at work. Something people highlight, for example, is that China's very good at shaping the debate at the Security Council in ways that you don't necessarily see in the chamber, but you see outside the chamber. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, the quality of diplomacy you see and how it's prioritized within the sort of larger Chinese approach to foreign policy.
I think in an ideal sense, Chinese elites are looking to deploy patriots into the system. In the fact that if you go off as a Chinese international civil servant, there is this expectation that you will be able to bring Chinese ideas, Chinese wisdom into solving problems of global governance. You also have on the record Chinese executive heads giving interviews where they talk about their conviction to defend Chinese national interests while at the UN.
Which I should say is not the norm when it comes to most Western countries, where at least performatively, they say that they are dispassionate civil servants at this point. They're not there to advance the national interests of their country.
At least performatively, as you note, everyone is trying to abide by Article 100 of the UN Charter once you become an international civil servant. To turn back to your question of like the quality of the diplomacy, I think there's a couple of interesting things to note, right? China, unlike other players at the P5, is not a penholder, so they do not take the lead in drafting UN Security Council language per particular issues. So it's very interesting that they don't feel the need to be, in this case, the first mover. The willingness, I think, in the recent round to sort of help manage the way that resolutions can move. Sometimes you read about sort of hard moves, the threat of a veto, actual vetoes themselves. The case of Syria alone, China has now vetoed with Russia 10 times, which is an extremely different set of behavior than what we'd seen in the prior decades, where China averaged 2 vetoes a decade. But again, this willingness, I think diplomats have also recently noted that on some issues, China is willing to act as a bridge to Russia in terms of trying to help cajole, help negotiate, help explain to Russia why its participation matters. And I think this is a very different view than the typical line that we would read in one version that's tracking events. You might read this in the news, where you're fed this idea that there's the P3, the Western veto players, Great Britain, the United States, and France on one side, and then you have China and Russia as this other bloc on the other side. And I think it's very interesting, to track those that are watching the UN full time, to point out the way that China has tried to help bridge the very large gap to try and get the Russian buy-in, and also to help manage the way that pressures fall on areas that China has been traditionally sensitive of. So, for example, China's management of the Myanmar question, which of course falls under the British pen. I think there's criticism of the UN Security Council for not issuing really resolutions with teeth, but at the same time, the ability to at least reach a consensus and again, compromise, to therefore at least come out with presidential statements, which require all 15 players to agree. And I think some credit would be offered at least to Chinese diplomacy and Chinese diplomats for helping to explain where the bottom line is for them and what happens if one moves to the bottom line. And therefore, is there another space in which the UN Security Council can engage on this particular question? Again, of a state that's on China's borders and therefore has a different set of interests for a place very close by, in a way that maybe a little bit more latitude might be offered for places far away.
Courtney, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thanks so much, Courtney.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you, Anjali, for having me.
So big thank you to Courtney Fung for speaking with us. Now, that was just a portion of our interview. Paying subscribers to Save Us From Hell can immediately access the full 40-minute interview. You can follow the links in the show notes of this episode, or just go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. You can listen to that bonus episode and future bonus episodes in the podcast player of your choice, or directly in the Substack app. I strongly encourage you to listen to the whole thing for even more of her insights. And Anjali, I was just thrilled to speak with Courtney, because this question, this idea of how China's role in the United Nations is changing as China becomes more powerful internationally, is so important, not just for the UN system, but for geopolitics more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's right. A sense of what China's goals are at the UN tells us a little bit about what the shape of the future decades is going to look like when we consider the kinds of ways that China wants to engage with multilateral institutions. But also, I was particularly struck by her discussion of how China introduces, or is very focused on, the kinds of language that are important at the UN, because it shows us the kinds of values and the kinds of ideas that they think are important to sort of help shape the nature of international politics.
One thing I was interested in, and this came through in the longer version of our interview, is I guess I didn't quite realize or appreciate that China is not the pen holder on any topic in the Security Council. So,
Yeah.
the term penholder in the Security Council refers to the country or countries that are the ones who write like the first draft of any resolution. And certain issues, certain topics, certain countries are the so-called penholders. So in Sudan, for example, the United Kingdom is the penholder. They'll be the ones that write the first draft. And that gives you, I think, like a kind of first mover advantage in terms of like nitty-gritty diplomacy. You get to kind of write down what you want to see first. It also suggests that you actually have like an active interest in a particular issue.
Yeah.
Right now, China is no penholder for any topic.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if in the future it might be. And if so, what issue might it hold the pen for? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it also is, I think, really interesting to note that it is not the primary. I think a lot of people don't know, as you said, right? It tells us a little bit, I think, about how the P3, the US, France, and the UK are still key movers on peace and security issues because they're the penholders. They get to put together the initial drafts. And thinking about what kinds of issues and what kinds of understandings of security and what kinds of understandings of peace China might be interested in using the chamber to shape is, I think, an important thing to consider from her interview.
Well, listen to the whole interview. That snippet was great. Again, huge thank you to Courtney Fung. You can listen to the full interview by upgrading your subscription to Save Us From Hell. We rely on listener support to keep this show going. So please do get a paid subscription. Follow the links in the show notes of this episode or go to globaldispatches.org/save us for a discounted subscription. And if you have recommendations for topics we should be discussing on To Save Us From Hell, please send us an email using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on Chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.